Turn in your Bible, if you would, to Ruth chapter 4, beginning in verse 13. We'll finish up our study of this book this evening. So far in our lessons, we've seen how Naomi traveled with her husband and her two sons to the neighboring land of Moab to escape a famine that was going on in the region around their hometown of Bethlehem. While they were there, the sons married Moabite women, and eventually they, along with their father, passed away in that foreign land. And so Naomi decides to return back to her homeland, back to Bethlehem, and one of the two daughters-in-law makes a commitment to go with her. Initially, both of them journey with her to probably around the border between the two nations. And at that point, she stops them and she says, okay, you guys need to go back to your homes. You've got a life to look forward to. You've got opportunities ahead of you. You can remarry. You can, have a full and productive life. And so you go back to your families, and I'm going to go back to my hometown. I'm going to go back to Bethlehem and live out the rest of my days there. One of the daughters-in-law said, okay, not that she was flippant or anything like that, but she recognized the wisdom and, the logic in what Naomi was saying, and so she was sorrowful. She hugged and wept, and they had a tearful goodbye. But they parted ways. Ruth, on the other hand, said, I'm not going to leave you. I'm going with you. I'm going to go all the way back to Bethlehem with you. I'm going to make your land my land. I'm going to make your people my people. And most importantly, she said, I'm going to make your God my God. And so she made that commitment to her mother-in-law, and she did indeed fulfill that commitment that she had made. And so they both return, or Naomi returns to Bethlehem. This would have been the first time Ruth ever went to Bethlehem. But they go to Bethlehem, and Ruth begins working in the fields, gleaning from the crops, as it was time of the barley harvest when they first arrived, and then it went into the time of wheat harvest right after that. And so for an extended period, probably 3 to 5 months, she was there working in the fields, doing pretty difficult manual labor. And so she was doing that to provide for herself and for Naomi, because they really didn't have any other means of sustaining themselves. And so she does that. Of course, there's a man named Boaz who recognized her character, recognized her hard work, and he was also just so happened to be the near kinsman, or a near kinsman to Ruth and Naomi. Naomi recognized that. She also saw the interest and the compassion that Boaz showed toward Ruth, and she instructed Ruth to go to Boaz and ask him to fulfill that role of the near kinsman, and taking not only the inheritance, the property, and things like that, but in marrying Ruth so that they could raise up a child to continue that family line. Being a godly man, Boaz agrees to help out, but he does point out that there is a nearer kinsman, somebody who was next in line before him to fulfill that role and to take on that responsibility. And so he said, we need to consult with this man, give him his opportunity to take this responsibility upon himself or to pass it on. And so they do that, and they present it to this man. Initially he agrees when he thinks it's just purchasing property and redeeming the inheritance. When he finds out that there's also a woman that needs to be married in order to raise up more children for the deceased, he decides that that's not in his best interest. Probably he already had a family, and that would complicate things for him personally. And so he declines and passes that on to Boaz, who happily accepts that responsibility. He vows before the elders there in Bethlehem that he will marry Ruth and take care of her and make this transaction official. And so that brings us to the last few verses of the book, where we see God's blessing realized for these two widows who had suffered so much and been through so much, and not only for the immediate future, but how God blessed them in a very great way in the big picture. So Ruth chapter 4, verse 13. Here the Bible says, So Boaz took Ruth, and she was his wife. And when he went in unto her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bare a son. So Boaz follows through with that commitment that he made before the elders of Bethlehem. He marries Ruth. About 9 months later, a son is born to Boaz and Ruth, and this child represented the continuation of the family line of Elimelech, who was Naomi's husband, her deceased husband, through the widow of Elimelech's son, Mahlon, that of course was who Ruth was married to, and so she was kind of in line to be that one who would be redeemed, or that the near kinsman would take care of. Naomi wasn't, because she had already had her sons, right? She had already had a family, and so now it's passed on to Ruth, and Boaz takes up that responsibility. The son that was born then would continue that family line. It's kind of interesting because in the lineage, while in a sense he was fulfilling that, going through Elimelech, Mahlon, and then through by Ruth, down to the next one who would be the son that was born here. Throughout all the lineages that we have, both here and also in the New Testament, it still sticks with Boaz as being the father and doesn't transfer it, which it legally would anyway under the Jewish system. And so it would seem that Boaz probably didn't have any other heir. He probably hadn't had a family before this point. I mentioned a few weeks ago that he was an older man. He probably was in his 70s or 80s maybe, even by the time that this was taking place. And so he wasn't a young person, and yet it would appear that he didn't have any other family, any other sons or descendants. And so this was likely a kind of a combining of the two families in one through Boaz and Ruth's child. So that kind of was an unusual circumstance and situation that was going on, but regardless, he was willing to do that, and he follows through with that. And so the family names wouldn't be forgotten, they wouldn't be left out, and in that culture especially, but really in many cultures even still today, that idea of continuing the family line was a very important thing, and it was a disgrace for the family, if it ended in whatever way. And so this was a very important thing, and God blessed him in a great way through allowing them to have this child. Verse 14, we see that the people of Bethlehem recognize this as God's favor shown to the family, in particular favor shown toward Naomi, who had been so grieved and so upset that she demanded that she wasn't even called Naomi anymore, but that they would call her Mara, which means bitterness, because of the bitter lot that she had in her life. So verse 14 says, "And the women said unto Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, which hath not left thee this day without a kinsman, that his name may be famous in Israel." The attention is focused here on Naomi probably for a couple of reasons. Number one, she was the one who was from Bethlehem, right? She was the one that they knew, the one that they were familiar with, and the one that they had seen, or at least known about, going through such hardships. Of course, when she left with a husband and two almost grown sons, probably grown sons at that point. And so she kind of had things going. She had a full family. She comes back, and now all the men in her life had passed away. She does still have this daughter-in-law, but in that culture, a daughter-in-law really doesn't get you as far as what sons would get you, unfortunately. But that was the case, and so they looked upon it. They said, she's lost a lot. She's lost basically her whole family, and now she's returned. She's sorrowful. She's not bitter herself, but she feels as if her life has been bitter, and so she wants to be called by this other name. But now things have changed for her, and God has shown his favor upon her. And so now, instead of being sorrowful and dealing with a life of bitterness, of hardships that she has to go through, now there's this sense that there's some fulfillment in her life, there's some joy, there's some purpose in her life, and so this is God's blessing upon her, that God is being good to her in this special way. The way that he did that, it says that he has provided this kinsman. Now there's some debate about who this kinsman is referring to. Some people say that it's talking about the child. He would become the kinsman who takes care of her, and we'll talk about that in a moment. To me, throughout the whole book, Boaz has been the kinsman. He's been the one that's been referred to, and to me that's the most direct understanding of what's said here. He did provide that kinsman through Boaz that would ultimately help provide for Naomi. The last part there, that his name may be famous in Israel. Again, some people want to apply that to the child, some people want to apply it to Boaz. I think that could also be referring to God, that God's name may be made famous or made well known in Israel. Now, we would think, well, God's name is already well known in Israel. We would hope that would be the case. But you remember, this was the time of the judges, right? And during the time of the judges, it was often the case that God's name was not proclaimed, that God's name was not made known in Israel. And so it could also be that it's saying that God has provided this kinsman in Boaz, and that through that his name will be magnified, that his name will be lifted up. And even among people who do know the name of the Lord and are aware of who he is and even worship him, this terminology isn't foreign, or it's not unusual to hear about the name of the Lord being made great among people, even people that already know about him. So I think that's what it's talking about here. But either way, what it's saying is God has been good to Naomi. God is taking care of Naomi. He's provided for her when it looked like everything was lost, when it looked like her life would end in struggle and difficulty and tragedy. Instead, now she is blessed. Now God's favor has been shown upon her, and so she will recognize that. Now going on to verse 15, we certainly do shift to the child at this point. There's no doubt about that by the way that this verse ends. So verse 15 says, And he shall be unto thee a restorer of thy life, and a nourisher of thine old age. For thy daughter-in-law, which loveth thee, which is better to thee than 7 sons, hath borne him. So obviously we're talking about the son now that Ruth had. And they speak about how good this is going to be for Naomi, how much of a blessing this is going to be for her. We see 2 things that this new baby would provide for Naomi. First, he would be a restorer for her life, it says, or the grandson would give Naomi the joy that had been missing in her life, give her that purpose in her life that she had been lacking. She had faced a lot of great loss with the death of her sons and of her husband, and she had been, convinced that heartache was kind of her lot at this point in life. Maybe she had some good times early on when they were in Bethlehem the first time, but it seemed like from the moment they left Bethlehem and went to Moab, at least not long after that anyway, that things kind of went downhill. Her husband died, later on her 2 sons died, and now she comes back to Bethlehem and she's in sorrow and hurting, and so she kind of feels like, well, this is what my life is going to be from here on out. And certainly that would be a difficult burden to bear, a difficult life to lead. But now things have turned, and now she does have joy and she has purpose. Many grandparents will attest to how much a grandchild can change things, right? How much joy and happiness that they can give. And I hear great-grandchildren are even better than grandchildren. I don't know. I think I was a great-grandchild. I can't imagine what I was a wonderful grandchild. I don't know that my kids were better than me, but they disagree, I think, by their looks. Not only that, this child would also provide assurance that Naomi would be taken care of as she aged and neared the end of her life. Obviously, that was going to take place initially through Boaz and his relationship with Ruth. They would take care of Naomi. But again, Boaz wasn't a young fella, right? He was older too. And so if he did pass away before Naomi did, then what would happen to Naomi? And of course, through this son, there would be that heir. There would be someone there to help take care of her even as she aged. As this child grew up and became an adult, he would be able to provide that for her. And so God has taken care of her not only in the immediate time, but through the rest of her life. God would provide for her, and she would be taken care of as a result of the birth of this child. And so God has certainly been good to her. Then the last part of this verse, Ruth shares in the credit in blessing as being that faithful daughter-in-law, the faithful one who stayed by Naomi's side when she decided to return to Bethlehem. Ruth continued to willingly work in the fields, do all she could to help provide. But not only that, she was willing to marry Boaz. Again, this wasn't her culture. I don't know if the Moabites had similar practices. Sometimes many of those cultures had similar ideas about things. Sometimes they didn't. But certainly as Naomi was leaving initially from Moab, she told Ruth, go back, marry whoever, and continue your life. It'll be better for you that way. And so certainly that was an option for her and something that was a potential for her. And yet she was willing to marry this man. And as Boaz said when she first approached him about this idea, that she could have gone after younger men. She could have gone after people who were more eligible or more desirable from an earthly standpoint. But instead she followed the customs of the Israelites, and she did what was needed. Not only to take care of herself, but to take care of her mother-in-law and to continue that family line of Elimelech through her husband, Mahlon, Elimelech's son. And so it recognizes those things. It praises her for having that willingness to do that and for doing the things that are right. It says that she's better than 7 sons. And again, this may pertain to the idea that the households were kind of joined together in Boaz's and Ruth's marriage. If Boaz didn't have any other heirs, then this son would not only inherit what had been passed down through Elimelech's household, but he would also come into the inheritance of that for Boaz. And so he would certainly have great wealth and great prosperity and be able to take care of her in a way that that maybe her own sons wouldn't have been able to do, because it would appear that Boaz was fairly wealthy and able to take care of a large household in that way. And so they see these things in Ruth, and they recognize them, and they give her that commendation there at the end of verse 15. In verse 16, we see Naomi's great affection for the child. It says, and Naomi took the child and laid it in her bosom and became nurse unto it. And so she takes it upon herself to care for this baby and basically raises him as if he were her own. It seems like Boaz and Ruth would have had to consent to this. It wasn't like she stole the child away or anything like that, but she had this fondness for the son, and she raised it basically as her own, like I said, and she took care of it and whatever needs it had. And again, that's another sign of Ruth's respect and love for Naomi, that she was willing to allow her to have this very prominent role in the child's life and upbringing. The bond between the two, between Naomi and the child, was so close that it was noted by the women of Bethlehem, and probably contributed to the name of the child. Verse 17 it says, and the women, her neighbors, gave it a name, saying, there's a son born unto Naomi, and they called his name Obed, which is the father of Jesse, the father of David. That name Obed means servant or helper. We've all probably heard little kids called Mama's little helper, right? And that seems to be almost the idea that's presented here, that this child would be Naomi's little helper. We don't like the word servant. To them it wasn't nearly as offensive as it is to us, but that's the idea. And so it was probably started off almost as a nickname, but it was adopted as his name. Naomi and Ruth and Boaz consented or agreed to that name, and so his name would be Obed from that time on, which means servant. Now the book concludes then with the lineage that does include this child that was born to Ruth and Boaz. Verse 18 says, now these are the generations of Pharez. Pharez begat Hezron, and Hezron begat Ram, and Ram begat Aminadab, and Aminadab begat Nashon, and Nashon begat Salmon, and Salmon begat Boaz, and Boaz begat Obed, and Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David. And so, as mentioned earlier in Ruth chapter 4, verse 12, Pharez was one of the sons of Judah, his second son, I believe, who had been born in Canaan and had followed whenever Israel took his family down to be with Joseph into Egypt. This was one of the 70 that went with them. And so, from Pharez, you trace the line on down. There are a few names that are kind of notable, or that you might notice. Of course, Aminadab, of course, that's probably not one that stands out to you, but Aminadab had a daughter whose name was Elisheba, and she would marry Aaron. You remember Aaron, Moses and Aaron, right? And so that's kind of an interesting connection that develops there. Of course, Aaron was the first high priest of Israel. He was not of the tribe of Judah, right? But his wife was of the tribe of Judah. Going on a little bit further, you come to the father of Boaz, a man named Salmon. Like Boaz, you probably know of his wife, or you might not know his name. His wife was a woman named Rahab. She had lived in Jericho, if you recall, on the wall of Jericho, and she harbored the spies from Israel as they came in to search out the city and see what was to be done about it. And she was spared because of her willingness to take care of those servants. Well, she married a Jewish man, this man named Salmon, and they had a child, and that child's name was Boaz. And so it's a small world, right? But when you think about that, it kind of maybe sheds some light on why Boaz was so compassionate and so willing to accept Ruth, right? His mother was an outsider. His mother wasn't a Jew. She was a Canaanite. And so now, as Boaz has become a man, he sees this foreign woman come into the city, come into Bethlehem, and he recognizes, she's in a bad state. She's in a bad situation through no fault of her own. She's lost her husband, and now she's living with her mother-in-law and taking care of her. Not that that's a bad thing, but she's doing that, and she's got a hard life now in difficult circumstances. And so he has a certain affection and compassion toward her, and I think probably the fact that his mother was an outsider played into that, and maybe God used that to kind of soften his heart, maybe where others in Bethlehem, others among the Israelites might not be quite as compassionate or ready to accept Ruth, regardless of her character and what she had displayed. So a couple of interesting names there. And then, of course, you end up with the most notable name, King David, right? We all know who King David was and the role that he played probably the greatest of the kings of the nation of Israel or of Judah. And so he was certainly noteworthy. And ultimately, that's one of the principal things about the book of Ruth as far as the Old Testament history goes and things like that. We read through it and we really fall in love with the story itself and the characters that are involved there. But generally for the Jewish people, these last few verses that we just kind of breeze over and say, okay, well, that's some more names in the Bible, and you go down the list. It was really important to them because this is the link between Judah down to David. Samuel, 1 Samuel, which is the next book there, it just goes back to Jesse, right? David was the son of Jesse. It doesn't tell us who Jesse was or where Jesse came from. And nothing else does in the Old Testament scriptures. Now, the New Testament accounts of the genealogy of Jesus, they follow this same line because Jesus was a descendant of David. And so that makes it even more important. Not only was he this great king, or were they the ancestors of this great king, they would be the ancestors of the Messiah. And so God, blessed them in a very special way in both counts. But this is where we have that little link between Judah down to David filled for us here in the book of Ruth. And so that was very important to the history of the Jews and to the lineage of not only David but also of Christ. And so God, chooses this kind of obscure family from a little town with kind of some strange connections, right? You've got all these Gentiles mixed in here, and Moabite and the Canaanite and all this stuff going on, and yet God chose this family to bless in this very special way, and so we have the record of it here in the Scripture. And so that brings us to the end of our study of the book of Ruth. There are certainly many lessons to be drawn from this brief account. Of course, in Naomi, I think we see some patient endurance. In some of her words, even when she came back to Bethlehem, she spoke about the bitterness of her life and the sorrow that she was going through, but she didn't do it in such a way as to condemn God in any way. She was going to be patient, and she was going to believe the sovereignty of God, trust in the sovereignty of God and the providence of God, even in this difficult time, even though it looked like her life was just going to be full of sorrow from that point on. She was going to bear that, and she was going to accept that as what God had in store for her, God had for her life. And so I think we can learn about patience in looking at Naomi. With Ruth, of course, we see faithfulness, we see a good work ethic. That's a hard thing for me to say. Maybe I don't have one, I don't know. But she was willing to work hard, and she was very faithful to Naomi. And that's a great lesson for us. Again, about our responsibility and the faithfulness that we ought to have and the willingness that we ought to have to do all that we can for others, in particular in the service of God. And then, of course, in Boaz we see the compassion and the kindness that he showed to Ruth and the favor that he showed, and also his willingness to step up and take the responsibility that was upon him. Now, he seems to have had a genuine affection for her, and so, when it's something that you want to do, if it's something that you want to be involved in, then certainly that makes it easier to step up and do the right thing. But he was willing, and this was a great responsibility on him, and so, we see that and we recognize that. And then finally, I think we see just the goodness of God and God's grace in taking this family, who was a little different from the common run-of-the-mill Israelite family with the good heritage and the good background and all those things, and you've got people mixed in there. In fact, you've got a few Gentiles mixed in, and I think that's a great reminder that God can work through anybody. He didn't have to work through the Jews exclusively. He chose the Jews as his people, and he did use them in a great way and very extensively, but there were Gentiles involved too, and I think that's a good reminder that God doesn't close the door to anyone, and that he offers the opportunity to all not only to be saved but to serve and to be part of the work that he has for us to do in his kingdom. So a lot of great lessons, and then of course the whole idea of the near kinsman and how Christ represented, or Christ filled that role for us. He was our near kinsman, the one who could redeem us very literally from an eternity of hell, an eternity of judgment. So a lot of different pictures that you can see and lessons that we can learn from this important book. And again, it reminds us that God keeps track of all things. As you look at that brief little bit of lineage, and if it's not for the book of Ruth, do we have that? Do we have that connection that we need? And of course, we do have it because God is faithful, and God makes sure that every I is dotted and every T is crossed and everything is as it should be. So we can trust God and His ability to take care of those things just as He has said. So any questions or comments about the book of Ruth?